This is the story of superstar bands where members turn into enemies and families are completely torn apart. These bands rocked the music charts, but their friendships went downhill from friendship to love to a lifetime of hate. And we begin with one of the most notoriously conflict-ridden bands in history. Aerosmith's climb to rock and roll stardom may have looked effortless from the outside, but beneath the fame, tension, and rivalry brewed within the band. A lineup of Steven Tyler, Joe Perry, Tom Hamilton, Joey Kramer, and Brad Whitford brought them fame and fortune, yet the same chemistry that fueled their iconic sound was also a volatile force, and one that eventually spiraled out of control. By 1979, years of personal and creative clashes had worn down their once strong bonds, pushing the group toward a breaking point. The final straw came not from the band members themselves, but from a confrontation between their families. During a heated argument at the studio, Perry's wife and Hamilton's wife got into a fight that quickly turned physical, and by the end of it, one had thrown a glass of milk at the other, which only escalated the tensions to a brand new high. When Tyler and the other members of the band discovered the aftermath, frustration boiled over and Tyler directed his anger at Joe Perry. It was here the band's internal conflict would erupt, with accusations and resentment taking center stage. However, the rift would go deeper than one single incident. Joe Perry had long been growing distant from the band's chaotic lifestyle and constant arguments and decided to call it quits. Perry's departure was a decision driven by exhaustion and a desire to break free from the pressures and dysfunction that surrounded the band. In the years that followed Joe Perry's exit, Aerosmith would struggle as the unity and intensity that had defined them faded. Though the bandmates eventually mended their differences, this era would leave long-lasting scars. Sadly, not every band manages to mend the rifts that come with fame and creative clashing. It's been called the saddest story of rock and roll. It's Creedence Clearwater Revival. John Fogerty, the frontman for Creedence Clearwater Revival, was not known for sharing the spotlight. While Tom Fogerty, his brother, Stu Cook on bass, and Doug Clifford on drums held down the swampy groove, John had cranked out a series of country and blues rock anthems like Proud Mary, Bad Moon Risin', and more. The band rose to meteoric fame in the 1960s, but simmering tensions would eventually erupt in the heart of Creedence Clearwater Revival. The camaraderie was apparent early on, and John, the main songwriter, was not afraid to cede some control. Stu Cook would once reminisce that in the beginning, John was very open to other people's ideas. Trouble was brewing, though, as John's control would tighten. He clashed with Fantasy Records, their label, who had pushed a more commercial sound. However, John Fogerty felt that they were trying to turn the band into bubblegum music. Meanwhile, Tom was a gifted songwriter himself and felt that his contributions were completely ignored. Tensions escalated after Tom left the band in 1971, and John later quipped, "We never really argued in front of each other, we just kind of stopped talking."
Eventually, Tom actually left the band, and that was, I think, a surprise to me. I tried to talk him into, really what I wanted us to do was take a break, because we were all pretty stressed, and he wouldn't hear of it. By then he wanted separation.
Said, "Stu, you go fix all those things that are still hurting me now that you set in motion, and then maybe I'll listen to your apology. But right now it's a pretty empty apology. Okay. I'm still being clobbered."
The legal battles became a new battlefield where John accused Fantasy Records of ripping him off on royalties, and Fantasy countersued, claiming that John owed them money for unfinished albums. John Fogerty even once lamented that it was a real shame because greed seemed to have gotten in the way. CCR officially disbanded in 1972, leaving a trail of bitterness. John had pursued a solo career, while the others formed Creedence Clearwater Revisited, a band that played Creedence songs, but without their chief songwriter. John would call Revisited a tribute band, while Cook would counter, "We're not a tribute band, we're three Creedence members." The animosity lingered for decades. Fantasy Records eventually ludicrously tried to sue Fogerty for writing songs that sounded like Creedence Clearwater. A glimmer of hope emerged in 1990, though, when Tom, before his passing, said that he still loved John and that he was his brother, and John remained tight-lipped. A final insult came from John Fogerty when in 1993, CCR would be inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. After accepting the award, John Fogerty got on stage and played some of the classic hits without his original band members, but rather a thrown-together group of players which included Robbie Robertson and Bruce Springsteen. Many people saw this as the ultimate middle finger to both his brother and his bandmates. Creedence Clearwater Revival's legacy remains untarnished. Theirs is a cautionary tale of allowing success and creative differences tear apart a band that had once burned so brightly. A story repeated again by country rock titans the Eagles. The Eagles took flight in 1971 when Don Henley and Glenn Frey left Linda Ronstadt's band to forge their own path. Joined by Bernie Leadon and Randy Meisner, they soared with a blending of country twang and rock and roll. In 1974, Don Felder was brought in to add another layer to their sound with his guitar talents, and things were smooth initially. And with hits like Take It Easy and Desperado, they would conquer the charts. However, the cracks began to appear as the band's sound would evolve. The million-selling Hotel California showcased Felder's scorching guitar solo, but it also marked the beginning of the end. Resentment festered when Felder's vocals on Victim of Love were mysteriously erased, and he began referring to Henley and Frey as the Gods, a hint of animosity brewing beneath the surface. By 1980, tensions would explode. Threats flew during a performance fueled by an argument over a political fundraiser. Frey and Felder were clashing on stage, and this onstage spat became a metaphor for the band's fracturing.
You're a real pro, Don, all the way. Yeah, you are too, the way you handle people. Except for the people you pay. Nobody gives a shit about it. Fuck you, I've been paying you for 7 years, you fuckhead.
The tour ended abruptly, and the Eagles would not perform together again for another 14 years. The disbandment was not official, but the brotherhood was clearly broken. In 2001, things took a legal turn when Felder was fired, and a lawsuit claiming wrongful termination and unfair profit sharing was soon to follow. He argued that Henley and Frey received a significantly larger cut despite an earlier agreement for equal splits. In his lawsuit, he claimed that the pair insisted they each receive a higher percentage of the band's profits. The animosity was obvious, and it spilled over into public accusations. Henley and Frey countersued, accusing Felder of breaching his contract and writing a scathing tell-all book. The legal battle would drag on for years, a constant reminder of their shattered past. In 2007, they reached a settlement, but the details remained a mystery, much like the inner workings of a band who was once known for their harmonious sound. The legacy of the Eagles is a mixed bag. They produce timeless music that continues to resonate with fans, but their story is also a cautionary tale of how unchecked egos and financial disputes can tear apart even the most successful bands. Felder's book, titled Heaven and Hell, My Life in the Eagles, perfectly encapsulated the Eagles' trajectory, a heavenly rise followed by a bitter and hellish fall. At least they kept their struggles to their members. The next group, however, got their fans involved. Formed in 1990 by Anton Newcomb in San Francisco, California, the Brian Jonestown Massacre were not your typical country rockers. They leaned towards psychedelic rock, but their flame out in Australia in November of 2023 was as dramatic as any country music feud. Things seemed to be all right at first. Newcomb was the domineering frontman who drove the band's sound, but cracks began to appear. In 1998, after a string of successful albums, the band signed with TVT Records, but it wasn't a happy marriage. The relationship between the label and the band went downhill, and tensions escalated in 2023.
Probably never, huh? He hates us anyways. You know that? I'm sure of it now. Like, we'll never ever play with those guys again, I bet.
During a Melbourne concert, Newcomb publicly kicked out guitarist Ryan Van Crete, yelling, "Cut off this guy's mic, the party's over, Captain." Van Crete was not having it and shot back at Newcomb before a brawl erupted on stage, with Newcomb swinging his guitar. Security then intervened, but the damage was already done. The tour had been canceled, and fans began to boo the band, even throwing things on stage. Fan accounts from the show painted a rather grim picture of Newcomb's mental state. He allegedly called them cancerous reptiles and all manner of expletives. Whether due to an alleged knife point incident or not, Newcomb's behavior had become erratic, and the band was not speaking about it publicly, leaving the reasons murky. The meltdown was not the first sign of trouble, though. A documentary by the title of Dig explored the band's whirlwind relationships, highlighting the love-hate relationship between Newcomb and Dandy Warhol's frontman Courtney Taylor Taylor. Just as the Brian Jonestown Massacre band took things public, the next band was even worse. The Black Crowes were formed in 1984 by brothers Chris Robinson and Rich Robinson, and were a southern rock powerhouse that were known for electrifying live shows and hit songs like Hard to Handle, She Talks to Angels, and Remedy. Despite their musical chemistry, the Robinson brothers' relationship was always a simmering pot. Early signs of trouble would emerge in 2001 when drummer Steve Gorman would be fired. Though the band never revealed the exact reasons, tensions between Chris and Gorman were rumored to be a factor. Gorman later likened the experience to getting dumped by your girlfriend. Things truly began to unravel in 2015, though. Following a nasty breakup, Chris publicly blasted Rich in interviews, declaring that they never had much of a relationship, and Rich admitted that he was fed up with the fighting and acknowledged it was unhealthy. The brothers would spend the next half-decade in separate bands, each achieving moderate success. However, a seed of reconciliation was planted when they both reached out to a mutual friend, expressing a desire to reunite. Once the connection had become rekindled, it led to a 2020 reunion tour that celebrated the band's 30th anniversary. Though tensions have not entirely vanished, the brothers seem to have found a way to coexist for the sake of the music. Chris acknowledged their contrasting personalities, but also their creative spark together, saying that they were complete opposites but the music was good. The Black Crowes were often called the American Oasis, sharing the British band's brand of bluesy rock bravado and well-documented sibling rivalry between Chris and Rich Robinson. It mirrored the Gallagher brothers' feud. They once commented that even their rivalry didn't match that of the Robinsons.
You guys look at, like, I'm thinking of the guys from Oasis, those two brothers. They can't fucking get in the room either. Do you look at them and go, oh, they're ridiculous. They should just get together.
No, of course not. I completely...
We toured with them.
That must have been...
And we freaked them out with our fights.
While the Black Crowes have made a successful comeback, we can't say the same for this next band. Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young were supposed to be the dream team of folk rock. David Crosby was the soulful singer from the Byrds and joined forces with Stephen Stills and Graham Nash, formerly of the Hollies. Together, their rich harmonies and introspective lyrics became a perfect match. Neil Young, another singer-songwriter with a more edgy sound, had come on board shortly after. They became rock royalty, and for a while, it seemed as though nothing could break them. However, signs of turmoil began to show in the early 1970s as personal tensions would rise. Crosby's increasingly erratic behavior, fueled by his drug use, would frustrate many, and in 1970, Stills told Rolling Stone that they argued about everything, and it was a creative tension, but it gets to be a real pain in the ass. Despite the friction, they had managed to release 2 successful albums, Deja Vu and CSN. By the late 70s, though, the band had fractured in half. Crosby's drug problems became worse, and legal troubles kept him out of commission. The remaining members would have to pursue solo careers with a varying degree of success. The 1980s then brought on a glimmer of hope. Crosby sobered up, and the band reunited in 1982 for Daylight Again, which then went platinum. But old habits do die hard, and Crosby relapsed, sending everything into a downward spiral. He was arrested multiple times and served prison time, and the band sputtered along, releasing albums that did not ever recapture their past glory. By the 1990s, the animosity had become too much, and Crosby had blamed Young for a poorly received album in 1988, while Young refused to tour with the band. They continued to reunite sporadically all throughout the next 2 decades, but the magic was clearly gone. In 2014, Nash publicly confirmed what everyone already knew, that Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young would never perform again because of his estrangement from David Crosby. Crosby's death in 2023 would finally end all possibilities of a full reunion. Their legacy is one of complexity. They were once one of the most influential bands of their generation, but their personal demons would ultimately tear them apart. The Byrds began in 1964 with Jim McGuinn, later known as Roger McGuinn, on lead guitar and vocals, Gene Clark on rhythm guitar, David Crosby on rhythm guitar, and Michael Clark on drums, along with Chris Hillman on the bass. Though none were country musicians, their initial sound was a jangly folk rock blending of heavily influenced by the Beatles, and their cover of Bob Dylan's Mr. Tambourine Man became a massive hit. This would cement them as pioneers of the genre. Tensions rose and problems began in 1965. McGuinn was a businessman who wanted to capitalize on their success in a more commercial way. Meanwhile, Clark, the band's heart and soul, had yearned for a more introspective and original direction. Tensions escalated during the recording of their second album, Turn, 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 where Clark felt that McGuinn was stifling his creativity, and Crosby, ever the outspoken one, would take sides with Clark, and Clark eventually left the band in 1966. Graham Parsons would then join the Byrds in 1966, and his influence pushed the band towards a more country rock sound, evident on their acclaimed album, Sweetheart of the Rodeo. However, legal issues with his previous band would force Parsons' vocals off most of the album. Parsons became frustrated and felt sidelined, and then left the band later that year. The Byrds then continued to experiment with psychedelic rock, but never recaptured their initial success. Crosby was increasingly frustrated with McGuinn's control and left in 1968 to form Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young. The Byrds then disbanded for the first time in 1973, a fractured shell of their former glory. There were no fistfights or lawsuits, but their legacy will forever be tainted by the bitterness of their breakups. McGuinn, the sole constant member, continued to tour under the Byrds' name for many years, much to the annoyance of his former bandmates. The Byrds fans were initially caught in the crossfire. Some followed their favorite members to their new projects, while others lamented the loss of the groundbreaking band. However, time has softened the blow, and today the Byrds are remembered for their innovative music, and their internal conflicts are seen as part of the creative churn that produced their absolutely amazing sounds. But unlike the Byrds, the Everly Brothers began young, robbing them of their individuality, a major cause of their feud and fallout. As teenagers growing up in Mississippi, the Everly Brothers took the musical world by storm in the late 1950s. Their angelic harmonies on hits like Bye Bye Love and All I Have to Do Is Dream would mask a complex relationship that would end up curdling into a full-blown hatred over the years. But some speculated resentment had festered, robbing them of their individuality. While initial success had brought them close, there was trouble that was brewing beneath the surface. And some speculate that Don, with his rock and roll leanings, may have felt overshadowed by Phil's sweet tenor. Problems became obvious during their 1960 UK tour, where Don's addiction to prescription drugs led to a nervous breakdown, and that left Phil to carry on alone. Business woes and the rise of Beatlemania only added pressure to the situation, and by 1973 the simmering pot had boiled over. At a gig in California, Don was intoxicated, mangled the lyrics, and argued with Phil on stage. Don then threw his guitar down, declaring that he was done with the Everly Brothers, and Phil had to finish the show alone. For a decade, the pair pursued solo careers with very little success. A reunion tour in 1983 proved that their voices still harmonized beautifully, but interviews would reveal a deep divide. They wouldn't even sit together, and Dave Edmunds, their producer, noted that Phil preferred to record Don's vocals first, claiming it sounded better that way, a petty slight in the grand scheme of things. A glimpse into the root of the animosity came from a mutual friend who had overheard a fight between the brothers. Through sobs and shouts, they kept referencing their father, and their arguments were laced with accusations of "Daddy said this" and "Daddy said that." The music industry may have pitted them against each other, but it seems that unresolved childhood issues had actually played a big part. Despite their personal animosities, the Everly Brothers' legacy is undeniable. The legendary Paul Simon brought them in for backing vocals on Graceland, and Simon and Garfunkel paid homage by bringing them on stage during a 2003 reunion concert. They never truly reconciled, and Phil's death in 2014 would end any chance of a final act. Don publicly expressed his love for his brother, a bittersweet coda to a complex and ultimately tragic relationship. Levon Helm and Robbie Robertson were the heart and soul of the band. Helm, with his deep southern vocals and powerful drumming, had embodied the group's earthy spirit, while Robertson, a guitar prodigy, had penned most of their hit songs and orchestrated the unique sound that would blend country, blues, rock, and roll. Their initial relationship thrived on mutual respect.
He was the closest thing in my life I've ever had to a brother.
Helm was already a seasoned musician who had brought Robinson under his wing when the teenager first joined the band's predecessor, the Hawks. Tensions would begin to simmer, though, during the group's most successful years. As the frontman and songwriter, Robertson took on a leadership role, booking tours, arranging photo shoots, and handling finance. Helm, however, preferred the simple life of just playing music. This fundamental difference in personalities would chip away at their camaraderie, and financial disagreements would widen the rift. Robertson was the chief songwriter who received a larger share of the royalties, something that Levon Helm contended was unfair. Things came to a head in 1976 when Robertson was tired of the road and wanted to focus on songwriting, and he decided to disband the group. Levon was furious with what he saw as Robertson destroying the band, reluctantly participated in their farewell concert.
Years or more after this, Levon hit some hard times. He was having some tough times with health and financial situations, some mental health issues, and he became angry, and he turned his anger towards me at this stage.
In the years that followed the last waltz, the animosity would only deepen. Levon Helm would publicly criticize Robertson in his autobiography, accusing him of taking songwriting credits that belonged to other members while monopolizing control of the band. Robertson had maintained that he wrote most of the songs and simply gave credit to Helm on a few out of brotherhood. There were no fistfights or lawsuits, but the public spats continued on, and in 2012, news broke out that Levon Helm was battling terminal cancer. Robertson visited him in the hospital, a gesture that some saw as a potential reconciliation. However, Helm died shortly after, leaving the true state of their relationship a mystery. The band's legacy is one of groundbreaking music that continues to influence countless artists. One of the saddest stories in all of country music comes from that of a mother and daughter duo known as the Judds. Naomi Judd and her daughter Winona were seemingly the picture-perfect country duo, but underneath they were locked in a complex and often volatile relationship. Naomi was a fierce and ambitious woman who had nurtured Winona's talent from a young age. They began singing together in the late 1970s, with Naomi's strong vocals being a perfect counterpoint to Winona's powerful delivery. The initial bond was, of course, undeniable. Naomi had pushed Winona to excel, and together they rose to superstardom in the 1980s, churning out hits like Mama He's Crazy and Why Not Me. However, when Winona turned 30, Naomi confessed a long-held secret. Winona had a different biological father than her younger half-sister Ashley, and this family secret, meant to protect Winona, had only caused a deep divide. The resentment simmered publicly. They maintained a united front, but tensions escalated. Naomi had battled depression, and Winona felt the weight of her mother's struggles. In 1991, Naomi's hepatitis diagnosis would force them off the road, and the hiatus became permanent. The hate was not always silent. In 2013, rumors swirled that the sisters were fighting over Naomi's will. Winona publicly denied the rift, stating that there was no argument. However, the public questioning would cast a shadow on the relationship. There were no physical altercations or lawsuits reported, but the emotional distance grew much wider. Naomi spoke of their bond, that they were different people, and they come together beautifully on stage but were not actually friends. The legacy became complicated. The Judds were a powerhouse duo that left behind a string of iconic country hits, yet their struggles had overshadowed their musical achievements. Fans who had once adored the mother-daughter harmony were left bewildered by the acrimonious split. Tragically, in 2022, Naomi Judd took her own life, and controversy erupted after her will surfaced, revealing that she had excluded her daughters and her husband became sole executor. Further to this, at the site of her death, a note was allegedly found saying, "Don't let my daughter come to my funeral. She's mentally ill."
When you lose someone you love, it's like, holy crap. This is really happening. Is this really happening? Your brain goes, no, this isn't really happening. And then you go home and I realized, yeah, my mom's not here anymore. And I can't even say it without crying. But at the time I was kind of like, I'm Winona freaking Judd, man. You know, I've got everything. And I go into this whole thing.
Winona continues to perform solo. Her powerful voice is a constant reminder of the musical magic that the Judds had once shared. Sisters Ann and Nancy Wilson of the band Heart saw their relationship hit a rocky patch after an unexpected incident took place during their 2016 national tour. The band was playing at the White River Amphitheater in Washington, just a short distance from where they had grown up. The show was supposed to be a big homecoming celebration for the Rock and Roll Hall of Famers, but backstage, things were taking a dark turn. It all begins when Nancy's 16-year-old twin sons had asked to check out Ann's new tour bus, and Ann's husband Dean agreed to take them. But when the boys left the bus, one of them accidentally left the door open, and that's when things escalated quickly. Dean's temper flared up instantly when he slapped one of the teens on the head, and that slap then turned into a punch. But it doesn't stop there. Dean grabbed the boy by the throat, and when Nancy's other son had tried to step in, he went after him as well, choking him until he couldn't breathe. Dean was soon arrested and charged with assault, and understandably, Ann's sister Nancy was furious about what had happened to her children. Ann stood by her husband, though. The sisters, who had been close for so long, were now suddenly at odds, barely speaking to each other. What should have been a night to remember for Heart fans became a moment that drove a serious wedge between the rock star siblings, and as a result of the incident, they stopped sharing dressing rooms and only communicated via text message for the very first time in their careers. Despite the tension, both Ann and Nancy publicly stated that they were not feuding over it. The duo insisted that they had different visions for the future of the band. Ann mentioned that while they were okay with each other, they had not yet figured out a compromise on their differing ideas for Heart. It wouldn't be until 2019 they finally reunited for their Love Alive tour, putting an ending to the 3-year separation. And after working through their issues, the pair talked about having a renewed appreciation for each other, with the hopes that the time apart had actually brought them closer together. Another songwriting partnership that dissolved but never really got to reunite was that of Eddie Van Halen and Sammy Hagar of the famous rock band Van Halen. The first of the fallouts between the virtuoso guitarist and the former Montrose frontman took place when the group's manager Ed Loeffler died of cancer in the early part of the 1990s. Up until that point, Loeffler had been the glue of the band that kept everything together, and after his death it all seemed to fall into disarray. When the group were then asked to make a song for the tornado action movie Twister, they just finished a long tour, and Hagar told his bandmates that he was exhausted, which soon led to a bitter exchange. That was the temperature of the band at the time, Hagar would tell Rolling Stone in 2022. It didn't matter what we were going to do, we were fighting about everything. The Van Halen brothers claim that Hagar quit in the aftermath, but the singer tells a much different story.
I was called by Eddie on Father's Day morning, Eddie just goes, you really frustrate me, you never do anything I asked you to do, and I'm going, well, yeah, I do. It's like, there really wasn't a problem like this in our whole 11 years of creativity. And he said, but you never do what I asked you to do, and I got so frustrated, I went and got Roth, and we've been working with him, and it's been working out great. And he goes, and you've always been a solo artist anyway, you might as well just go back to being a solo artist. Quote, unquote, exactly that.
The group then reunited in 2004 for an arena tour, but unfortunately, the hatch had not been buried. Van Halen was a band in name only when they reunited with Sammy Hagar for the tour, and it was more like an experiment where two bitter factions, the Van Halen brothers on one side and Hagar and bassist Michael Anthony on the other, were trying to see if making money and loving their fans outweighed their hate for each other. It may have possibly worked if Eddie Van Halen was sober at the time, but unfortunately he was not. The guitarist was also incredibly angry that Sammy had tried to advertise his Cabo Wabo tequila on the tour, even tattooing the logo on his arm. Tensions boiled over at the last show in Tucson, Arizona. In his memoir titled Red Rocker, Hagar would write that Eddie had come up to him before the show and rolled his sleeve down over his Cabo Wabo tattoo. Sammy rolled his sleeve back up, had some choice words for Eddie, and that turned into one of the worst shows that they had ever done in their lives. Eddie played so bad that night that he was completely gone and out of it.
Then that's when I step in and say, hey, this is up, man. You played like shit, and it's embarrassing to me to have to try to sing. You're so out of tune. That's what was going on in the reunion tour. And that's when we bumped heads. That's when it really got bad. It was like, well, I can't be around somebody.
It should be noted that Hagar and Van Halen had made peace shortly before the guitarist died in 2020, but they never played together again. The story of Van Halen is not much different from that of Rolling Stones legends Keith Richards and Mick Jagger. For years, Jagger and Richards had been the faces of the Rolling Stones, but behind the curtains, their relationship was often a roller coaster. While the two had made rock and roll history together, the partnership had always walked a fine line between creative collaboration and bitter rivalry. One of the biggest blows to the bandmates' relationship came in the 1980s. Jagger, who was always the more business-minded of the two, decided to break away and go after a solo career. And to Keith Richards, this was nothing short of betrayal. It wasn't only that Mick was working on his own music, it was that Jagger seemed to be turning his back on the Rolling Stones when the band needed him the most. Richards believed the move felt selfish and unnecessary, and this resentment spilled over into the public eye. He wasn't shy about calling Jagger out, as the guitarist famously called him Her Majesty for what he had perceived to be Jagger's diva-like attitude towards the band. He would go on to comment that it was the beginning of the 80s and Mick had become unbearable. Beyond the professional tension, the pair's personal relationship was bitter. Richards' memoir, Life, published in 2010, laid bare the guitarist's frustrations with biting remarks about Jagger that would put even more distance between the two. Richards wrote about the chasm that had grown between the pair, saying that he used to love Mick, but he hadn't been to his dressing room in 20 years. Sometimes he had thought to himself that he missed his friend and wondered where he had went. He also dismissed Jagger's solo album, Goddess in the Doorway, saying that it was like Mein Kampf. Everyone had it, but no one read it. What made this hate battle even more fascinating is that despite the years of tension, the duo never let it fully break the band apart. Richards often compared their relationship to that of brothers, sibling rivalry included. The Rolling Stones bandmates knew how to push each other's buttons. However, the duo also knew that they needed each other to make the magic that fueled the band's success. So while the fights may have become nasty, Richards and Jagger always found a way to make it back to the music. If you're enjoying this video, be sure to hit that subscribe button right now, like the video, and leave a comment below. Another duo who managed to eventually find their way back to the music was 80s superstars Tears for Fears. Just like with any other duo on this list, the fallout between Roland Orzabal and Kurt Smith of Tears for Fears was a classic case of creative forces pulling in different directions. The band's rise to fame in the 80s was meteoric, with hits like Shout and Everybody Wants to Rule the World making the two global icons. But behind the scenes, the pair's partnership began to fray as the pressures of fame and artistic ambition, along with personal differences, began to build up. By the late 80s, the pair had hit a wall during the making of The Seeds of Love, an album that took years to produce and nearly drove them apart. Orzabal, who was known for being a perfectionist, wanted to push the band's sound into new and more complex directions, while Smith was frustrated with the increasingly drawn-out process and longed for something much more simple. The strain of the album's production, combined with both of the men's evolving visions for the band, had led Smith to walk away in 1991.
How long did the two of you go without speaking?
9 years.
Yeah.
9 years, 2 months, and 3 days.
4 hours, 6 minutes, 24 seconds.
For much of the 90s, Orzabal carried on with Tears for Fears in name, while Smith went solo, but neither was able to fully replicate the magic they'd once had together. In 2022, the duo released The Tipping Point, which hit their highest chart position in 30 years, showing that despite it all, they managed to turn their differences into strengths. But unfortunately, not every duo gets that kind of happy ending. Even though Orzabal and Smith found a way to move forward, some pairs never really patch things up, just like 80s superstars Hall & Oates. After decades of producing string of hit after hit and dominating the charts, including songs like Rich Girl, Kiss on My List, and Private Eyes, one of the most iconic duos in rock history hit a rough patch from which they never fully recovered.
Sean and I are brothers, right? But we are not creative brothers. We are business partners. We did a lot of stuff. We made records called Hall & Oates together, but we've always been very separate. We were separate on the records too. You know that song Kiss on My List?
Of course.
I did all those. That's all me. That's all me. All those harmonies, that's me.
The breakup of Hall & Oates wasn't only about creative differences like it is in most bands. Like so many acts before them, it was all about money and business. In 2023, Oates made a move that would shock Daryl Hall. he tried to sell his share of their jointly owned company, Whole Oats Enterprises, without Hall's consent. Whole Oats Enterprises controls a large portion of the duo's legacy, including their trademarks, personal name, and likeness rights, along with record royalty income from all of their years of hard work. As expected, Oates' decision took Hall by surprise, and Hall felt that the move had violated their long-standing agreement. However, what no one saw coming was the disaster that would soon follow. What unfolded was a contentious legal battle, with Hall seeking and obtaining a restraining order in order to block the sale. For Hall, the incident exposed deeper issues that had been simmering for years, those of trust and miscommunication that had remained unresolved.
It was kind of ruining my life, to be honest with you. I wasn't happy. And I said, well, I'll just step aside. And people do it all the time. I mean, you look at all the artists who are selling all their catalogs. It's pretty common. It's not that big a deal. But
Hall later acknowledged that despite the continued performances together, the creative partnership had been minimal for about the last 25 years, largely limited only to their live shows. The business dispute seemed to be the final straw in the relationship that had been strained for quite some time, and after some legal back and forth, the pair officially split in 2024. Even to this day, it's impossible to overlook the bad blood that flows between them. Unlike Hall and Oates, the root of this next duo's feud would be their creative differences. I'm talking about none other than Simon and Garfunkel. The tension between Paul Simon and Art Garfunkel is one of the most well-known in music history, marked with decades of personal and professional conflict. Their partnership, which began in the 1950s when they performed under the name of Tom and Jerry, seemed to be promising from the start. But the cracks appeared early on when Paul Simon recorded solo songs without having informed Garfunkel, leaving the latter feel betrayed. This initial act of secrecy would set the tone for what would become a tumultuous relationship. As Simon and Garfunkel reached staggering heights with hits like The Sound of Silence, Mrs. Robinson, and Bridge Over Troubled Water, the underlying creative tensions had never disappeared. Simon, who had written most of their material, often felt overshadowed by Garfunkel's role as the lead singer. The imbalance would fuel resentment, with Simon feeling as though his contributions were being eclipsed by Garfunkel's more visible position. Their relationship took another hit when Garfunkel decided to pursue an acting career, and Simon saw this as Garfunkel's attempt at abandoning their music career and became increasingly resentful.
You know, we're friends since we were 12 years old, but our musical inclinations are quite different. And so we would have disagreements, and the disagreements could be, you know, real arguments that could stop a session.
By 1970, the duo had finally called it quits shortly after the release of their critically acclaimed album, Bridge Over Troubled Water. Though they reunited several times for tours and special performances, the underlying animosity had never fully healed. In interviews, both have expressed long-standing grievances. Simon, for instance, had once recalled a hurtful comment Garfunkel had made about always being taller than him, something that Simon remembers even decades later. While the pair made incredible music, their creative differences and tensions ultimately kept them from fully mending their relationship. And much like these duos and their personal problems, that of Axl Rose and Slash from Guns N' Roses is not much different. With Axl Rose and Slash of Guns N' Roses, the clash begins in the early 90s. Fueled by starkly different personalities and lifestyles, Axl Rose's intense perfectionism and volatile nature had contrasted Slash with his more laid-back attitude and substance issues.
When I first met, he shacked up at my house when I was still living at my mom's house. Yeah. And we had some interesting situations. One morning I took off, went to work, and I guess in the afternoon, he woke up, went up, and passed out on my grandmother's couch. Really? Right. He had to get up and whatnot, so he went downstairs, and so I thought, well, I had to confront this issue. So we had rehearsal that night, and we got in the car, and I very delicately put it to him that was sort of rude and whatever, and his reaction was to jump out of the car. It was probably about 35, 40 miles an hour.
However, the breaking point really came in 1996 when Slash left the band, with his reason being irreconcilable differences. This departure led to a storm of public bashing, with both Rose and Slash taking jabs at each other in interviews. Rose even went as far as to call Slash a cancer, criticizing the guitarist along with bassist Duff McKagan for having stifled his creativity during the Use Your Illusion tours. Slash's exit from the band would turn out to be a turbulent time for Guns N' Roses, as Rose had kept the band name alive, but with a rotating lineup. Slash and other members of GNR went on to form Velvet Revolver, while Rose remained the sole constant in Guns N' Roses itself. Despite years of animosity, the Rock Gods had managed a dramatic reunion in 2016, bringing back the classic lineup for a successful tour, which delighted fans and critics alike. Another split between singer and guitarist that turned particularly nasty was that of Dimebag Darrell and Phil Anselmo from Pantera. In early December of 2004, Pantera frontman Phil Anselmo unloaded on guitarist Dimebag Darrell in an interview with Metal Hammer magazine. The group had been inactive for 3 years at that point, and both sides would blame each other for the impasse. Anselmo said that Dimebag had developed a crippling drinking problem, and the guitarist turned around and said that the singer was using heroin. There was never a point when Dimebag could not get a drink, Phil would say, which was pretty much every day, and now I'm hearing it's worse than ever. Phil would go on to say that Darrell attacked him vocally, and due to Darrell's smaller stature and Phil's size at the time, Phil could have easily taken him in a physical altercation. Anselmo even went as far to say that Darrell deserved to be beaten severely. Phil and Darrell would form a band called Damage Plan, and days after this interview would be released, a deranged fan would head to one of their shows and take the life of Dimebag Darrell on stage. Fans were outraged and pointed to Phil's interview as a reason for the attack. That heated rhetoric in the final days of Dimebag's life would cause deep divisions between Phil Anselmo and Pantera drummer Vinnie Paul, the brother of Dimebag Darrell. Those were never resolved, and Paul died in 2018. Phil Anselmo recently reunited Pantera in a way, taking along original bassist Rex Brown and reviving the band with guitarist Zakk Wylde. Not all bands can see a reuniting or a happy ending to their time, and that's no more clear than in the duo of Mick Jones and Joe Strummer from The Clash. By 1982, The Clash seemed to have it all. Their music was taking off globally, especially with hits like Rock the Casbah and Should I Stay or Should I Go, which had thrust them into the mainstream spotlight. They were no longer only a punk rock band, but actually royalty, even opening for The Who in stadiums, something that would have been unimaginable just a few years before. But as often happens with success, trouble was brewing behind the scenes. The first crack in the armor came from within. Drummer Topper Headon, who had partially been responsible for writing Rock the Casbah, was battling a severe addiction, and despite his immense talents and contributions, his personal struggles began to interfere with the band's dynamic. As much as they had valued his role, his substance problems became unmanageable, and they were left with no choice but to let him go. This decision, while being necessary, was the first domino to fall in what would soon be a chain reaction of conflict and missteps. While the band had attempted to press on, deeper tensions between frontman Joe Strummer and guitarist Mick Jones began to brew. Strummer was deeply connected to The Clash's punk origins, wanting to take the band back to its raw and rebellious roots, while Jones, on the other hand, had been drawn to new musical influences, particularly that of hip-hop, which was fast gaining popularity at the time. These diverging creative visions had made it difficult for the two to see eye to eye, with their disagreements becoming more frequent and intense. The boiling point came after The Clash's performance at the 1983 U.S. Festival. By all accounts, the show was a disappointment, and it was clear that the band was not functioning as a cohesive unit anymore. As a result, Mick Jones would be fired from the group, and in the aftermath, Strummer and Simonon tried to keep the band alive. They brought in new members to the group and released an album called Cut the Crap in 1985, but unfortunately it was a critical and commercial failure. Fans and critics alike felt that without Mick Jones, The Clash had lost the essence that made them special. The energy and spark that once defined them had vanished, and it became evident that the magic of The Clash would never be recaptured. At the end of 1985, it became so bad that Strummer made the difficult decision to break up the band for good. And while The Clash did not have their happy ending, the next sibling duo was able to iron it out eventually, at least sort of. With the Gallagher brothers Noel and Liam from Oasis, the tension first came to the surface in 1994 during a gig at the Whiskey A Go-Go in Los Angeles, California. Liam's temper had led him to insult the band and throw a tambourine at Noel, who then walked off stage and disappeared for days. The brothers' animosity was further highlighted in a 1995 interview with a journalist released as a recording titled Wibbling Rivalry.
Getting thrown off ferries, then why don't you go and support West Ham? Get the out of my band and go be a football hooligan, right? You have bought me a couch. But you probably think it's...
No, I'll say what it is, but I was into it,
You're
right,
up to being seen as bad lads. Marcus Russell, right?
He's another fucking...
Shut up, you dick, right? He gets off the ferry after getting deported. I'm left in Amsterdam.
The rift only deepened from there, and during the 1996 MTV Unplugged performance, Liam, citing a sore throat, pulled out at the last minute, but then went on to heckle Noel from the audience while Noel took over lead vocals. The battle would reach a physical peak in 2000 during a tour in Barcelona, where a heated argument over Noel's daughter had led to a fistfight and Noel briefly leaving the band.
Outside, look, we're sitting outside a festival that we were headlining. There was about 70,000 people there, and there was a huge fight in the dressing room, and I sat in the back of a car, and I calmed down, and my security guard said, "Are we staying or going?" And I'd been on the verge of leaving a couple of times before, and I just thought, tonight's the night.
One of the most legendary fallouts in music history would be that of Beatles songwriters and Oasis heroes, John Lennon and Paul McCartney. The disdain between John Lennon and Paul McCartney was particularly disastrous because not only was it heated publicly, it almost broke up the Beatles in their prime. Their conflict would be rooted in their creative differences, which became increasingly evident as the band's success grew. The feud reached a boiling point in 1971 when Lennon publicly criticized McCartney's solo work in an interview with Rolling Stone. He called McCartney's album rubbish and expressed disdain for the Beatles' documentary Let It Be, which he claimed was a Paul-centric setup. Lennon also accused McCartney of making the band's final years frustrating by sidelining the other members. McCartney would not be silent in the face of Lennon's attacks. He responded with veiled jabs in his own music, like the song Too Many People, which had criticized Lennon's actions and their fallout in a subtle way. Lennon's response would come with How Do You Sleep, a diss track that discredited McCartney's contributions to the Beatles, suggesting that McCartney's only significant achievement was the song Yesterday. Their feud was not only musical but also deeply personal, with Lennon making harsh remarks about McCartney and McCartney firing back through his music. Despite all the bitterness, they eventually reconciled. In the years before Lennon's death, they mended their relationship, finding common ground in their roles as fathers while reconnecting over simple conversations such as discussing baking bread. Unlike any of the other breakups on this list, the next group fallout came at the expense of a deep romantic connection. Before Wyclef Jean and Lauryn Hill began their romantic affair near the height of the Fugees' success in 1996, their song Killing Me Softly had become a worldwide #1. But they should have gone back and studied the history of bands like Fleetwood Mac to learn that this was a spectacularly bad idea. It was like we were two outlaws in love, Jean would write in his 2012 memoir Purpose, An Immigrant Story. We had flights on planes, and a few times when it went down, she started swinging at me right there in the seats. Jean would go on to comment that there were a few times they had almost become arrested, and the situation grew even worse when Hill discovered that she was pregnant and told Jean that he was the father, even though the pregnancy was a result of an affair with Rowan Marley, the son of Bob Marley. Jean would remark that in that moment something had died between the pair. Jean was actually married at the time and having an affair with Hill. He would say that she could no longer be his muse after revealing that the baby wasn't his, and that the love between them had actually died out. However, when Hill has addressed the breakup directly, she often points to creative disagreements and battles over credit. In the end of it all, she saw the Fugees as a model of control, manipulation, and dependence, saying that she wasn't even allowed to say that she was great because it was considered arrogance and conceit. If you've made it this far, be sure to like the video and hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss another video from Project Hysteria. The final pair on our list is the Everly Brothers. The rift between the Everly Brothers is one of the most dramatic stories in music history, marked by a chaotic ending which highlighted the deep-seated issues between the siblings. Don and Phil Everly were crucial figures in American rock and country music, but their bond had frayed spectacularly in the early 1970s. The trouble all begins when the Everly Brothers had clashed with their manager Wesley Rose. Rose had controlled access to top songwriting material through his publishing house, and this dispute would lead the brothers to losing access to their own compositions, forcing them to perform cover songs. By the mid-1960s, the brothers' career was in decline, and personal struggles, including addiction issues, had worsened their situation. The final blow came on July the 14th of 1973 during what was supposed to be a celebratory farewell concert at Knott's Berry Farm in California. After a decent performance the night before, Don Everly showed up drunk, stumbling and slurring his way through the set. His erratic behavior had frustrated Phil, who in a fit of anger had smashed his guitar and walked off the stage, declaring he could no longer perform with his brother. As Phil had left, Don tried to push through, but eventually told them that the Everly Brothers had died long before, and it was a brutal declaration that had summed up the deep cracks that had been forming between them. Just like the Everly Brothers, the two central figures of UK group UB40 were also brothers who found themselves at the center of the band's biggest conflicts. UB40's story begins with the Campbell brothers, Robin and Ali, a group of friends who formed the band in Birmingham in 1978. After the formation of the band, it would not take long before hits like Red Red Wine had propelled them to global fame. But as the band rose to the top, tension simmered beneath the surface, with the brothers' ambitions and egos clashing as their success grew. Years of creative and personal disagreements began to fracture the group, and in 2008, Ali Campbell, the band's lead singer, stunned fans by leaving the group. Ali had claimed that he was fed up with the band's management and financial disputes, but his departure left the rest of the group reeling. In an effort to move forward, the rest of the band took over, and UB40 continued without Ali. But things were far from resolved. Shortly after leaving, Ali began his own band and called it UB40, featuring Ali Campbell. This would lead to a furious feud over the band's name and legacy. What followed would be a bitter legal and personal battle that had split not only the band, but also the Campbell family itself. The brothers became entangled in lawsuits, each one fighting to claim the UB40 name and legacy as their own. Fans were forced to choose sides, while the family fractured under the weight of accusations and betrayal, along with greed. The feud grew so intense that Ali didn't even attend his parents' funerals, and even as their brother Duncan's health would go downhill over the years, the two never reconciled.
You know, the saddest thing is that he's never spoken to us since. I think there's an amount of bitterness, you know, because when he left, he didn't have the success that he thought he was going to have.
The same can be said in the case of Rage Against the Machine. In the heart of the 1990s, Rage emerged as a seismic force in rock and roll music, but what the public didn't see was the very passion that fueled their artistry also sowed the seeds of their undoing, leading to a tumultuous breakup in the year 2000. The split was announced by lead singer Zach De La Rocha, who cited a complete breakdown in the band's decision-making process, particularly following a dramatic incident at the MTV Video Music Awards, where bass player Tom Comerford caused a scene.
Madman. I wanted to bring the whole thing down, but they didn't move. In my mind, I visualized.
At the event, Rage Against the Machine's video for Sleep Now in the Fire was up against Limp Bizkit's Break Stuff, which ended up winning. Feeling that Rage's video was more deserving, Comerford ignored advice from his bandmates and decided to climb up on a piece of the set.
I wanted to bring the whole thing down, but they didn't move.
After this, internal conflicts only continued to escalate as the band members argued over trivial matters. Tom Morello would later reflect on the chaotic period, recalling how petty arguments spiraled into full-blown fistfights.
Rock bands are rock bands, you know what I mean? And they're made up of creative people who sometimes have differences, and sometimes those differences sort of outweigh the moment.
While Rage had tried to work things out, the members of Cream did everything in their power to tear the band apart. In the pantheon of rock legends, there are few bands that have burned as brightly and flamed out as spectacularly as Cream. Beneath the surface of their musical genius, there was a cauldron of rivalry and personal conflict that would ultimately consume the band from within. From the beginning, the chemistry that had made Cream sound so dynamic also sowed the seeds of discord. Baker and Bruce, two powerhouse personalities, were locked in a constant battle for supremacy. Their fierce egos clashed with alarming regularity. Eric Clapton, who had tried to play the role of peacemaker, found himself caught up in the crossfire, looking on as the band's creative potential devolved into a cacophony of arguments and personal attacks. The onstage battles became legendary, with Bruce cranking his amplifiers to ear-splitting levels in an attempt to drown out Baker's drumming, leading to the chaotic performances where the music was drowned out by ego.
Our first sort of talk-through rehearsal at Ginger's house in Neasden, and those two had a sort of argument right away, because I think Jack had done an interview talking about it and sort of spilled the beans and let the cat out of the bag, and Ginger was upset about that, and so there was it went along the lines of, well, there you go, you've done it again.
As tensions mounted, the band's internal struggles began to overshadow their creative output. Clapton's growing frustration became obvious as he realized that instead of crafting music together, they were competing against each other for dominance. By May of 1968, the inevitable conclusion had loomed large. The once promising supergroup prepared to call it quits. Their last concerts were a farewell to a partnership that had promised so much, yet succumbed to the relentless forces of rivalry and pride. Another band that saw a similar fate was the Police. This band's meteoric rise was as much fueled by tension as it was by talent. Sting, Stuart Copeland, and Andy Summers had clashed on a constant basis, with their notorious feuds often spilling out into the public eye. They were one of the biggest bands of the early 1980s, but the relentless infighting had threatened to unravel them long before their final days. By the time they recorded Synchronicity, the animosity had grown so intense they couldn't even stand to be in the same room with each other, and each member had to record their parts separately. Sting became increasingly frustrated by compromise and the relentless battles with bandmates, and began seeing the band as an obstacle to his own ambitions. When the group played Shea Stadium in 1983, Sting had mentally checked out, deciding that it was his peak moment and his cue to pursue a solo career. An attempt at a reunion in 1986 quickly reignited old tensions, with the same ego clashes and resentment driving them apart once again. They had met as bandmates, not lifelong friends, and once the initial spark faded, nothing held them together outside of fame.
Okay. I'll tell you what, should we film me whooping Sting?
Yes,
that would be good, wouldn't it?
And before we move on, if you're enjoying the video, make sure that you subscribe to the channel right now, because you never want to miss another great video like this one in the future. Also, consider buying me a cup of coffee. I'm really thirsty, and coffee keeps me going and making these videos for you. Speaking of fractured relationships, Motley Crue also had its fair share. Just like most of the bands on this list, Motley Crue's story is one of skyrocketing success, fueled by chaos, ego, and relentless tension that ultimately tore the band apart. By the time their 1989 album Dr. Feelgood had topped the charts, members were entangled in brutal battles with addiction and spiraling conflicts that constantly threatened their unity. Nikki Sixx's near-fatal overdose in 1987 had forced the band into rehab, but even after their supposed recovery, the dysfunction had only simmered below the surface. Each member struggled with intense personal issues, with Sixx's overdose only being one part of a more dark pattern that had plagued them all. In 1992, the simmering hostility boiled over as Vince Neil was pushed out amidst creative and personal clashes, marking a turning point that had sent the band into a chaotic period of lineup changes and diminishing success.
The way we had the band going was like everybody had 25% input in everything. And so 75% voted me out. You know, they're great guys. You know, they just had to do what they felt they had to do.
Neil's absence left a noticeable void. While John Corabi stepped in as the new frontman, he had failed to capture the chemistry that had originally defined Motley Crue. Other members' personal troubles worsened during this time, particularly drummer Tommy Lee's high-profile legal issues and jail time, which had only magnified the growing rift among them. When Motley Crue announced their final tour in 2014, signing a legally binding cessation of touring agreement to solidify the breakup, it was an attempt to close this tumultuous chapter with dignity. But even that would be short-lived. The 2019 release of The Dirt, however, reignited fan interest, drawing the members back together, and despite years of friction that had proven impossible to resolve. One band that had never gotten to recover from their tumultuous relationship was the Mamas and the Papas. Although they may have been known for dreamy, mellow harmonies, the band's offstage dynamics were anything but smooth. John Phillips, the band's founder and primary songwriter, had struggled with maintaining control, especially as Cass Elliot, otherwise known as Mama Cass's charm and vocal presence began to captivate the public eye. From the beginning, Phillips had misgivings about Elliot joining the band, partly due to her weight, which he feared may impact the group's image. But when Elliot's voice became one of the band's defining features, Phillips' insecurity grew. Beneath the music, romantic entanglements created deep divisions. Phillips's wife Michelle and the group's other female vocalist had a secret affair with singer Denny Doherty, and when Phillips discovered it, the powder keg exploded. According to Michelle, Phillips never caught the two sleeping together. He did, however, catch them in a compromising situation. In the singer's words, "John didn't actually find us, but he did come downstairs and I was sitting on Denny's bed in my nightgown, feeding him candies." On the other hand, Mama Cass was also in love with Doherty, and the revelation of this affair with Michelle left her devastated. The affair's fallout became quite public knowledge and led to the creation of I Saw Her Again, a hit inspired by the turmoil. Despite all of the success, the betrayal would continue to weigh heavily, with John eventually attempting to remove Michelle from the group. Fan backlash would force her to return, making it clear that John's authority over the group was not as absolute as he had hoped. Adding to the turmoil, the band's hard-partying lifestyle would amplify the cracks, and they often drank and used substances before recording sessions, blurring the lines between personal grievance and professional commitment.
When we took drugs, we were taking psychedelics, and we were looking for a better place. We were trying to expand our minds, and
Elliot and Phillips frequently clashed over creative control, as Elliot sought solo opportunities and a larger role beyond the group, sparking further friction with Phillips, who felt his grip on the band slipping away. Elliot's growing independence and influential social life had only intensified the situation, and her popularity as a host of major music industry figures had placed her in a position of power that Phillips found hard to tolerate. By 1969, the combination of strained relationships, personal ambitions, and unresolved conflicts had pushed the band to its breaking point. Their music had soared to great heights, but their intense, tangled personal lives ultimately proved to be too volatile for long-term unity.
demanding time of my life. But when I hear it, I'm overwhelmed with pride.
From your perspective, what were the key factors in the breakup of the group? Some would say premature breakup because you were still, it would seem, in full creative flower.
No, we weren't in full creative flower. We had exhausted the creativity at hand, and I think that it was unfortunate that there was just too much asked of us at that point.
Just like the Mamas and the Papas, Fleetwood Mac was also ruined due to the various romantic entanglements that occurred with its members. The band, which was already no stranger to lineup changes, reached a brand new level of instability with the addition of Christine McVie, Lindsey Buckingham, and Stevie Nicks. Although these new members brought undeniable talent, they also added layers of emotional complexity that would eventually consume the group. The relationships within Fleetwood Mac were a tangled mess. Buckingham and Nicks joined the band as a couple, but their relationship soon began to fracture under the pressures of fame and constant proximity. Their breakup did not stay contained with their personal lives, and it bled into their music, leaving tension simmering in the studio and on the stage. Meanwhile, the marriage between John and Christine McVie, both long-standing members, was also crumbling down. Watching each other in close quarters while going through a painful split had only intensified the group's emotional turmoil. After the split, tensions in Fleetwood Mac were already simmering, yet the band pressed on, pouring their emotions into the making of Rumors in 1977.
You wrote, among other things, Go Your Own Way and Secondhand News. Mm-hmm. What were you saying to Stevie?
Well, I think both of those are basically saying, hey, I'm resigned to whatever happens, but it's a damn shame. And it's not what I want. And I think that's really about it, you know. Actually, secondhand news, at least it has a little bit of tongue-in-cheek humor in it, because it's basically saying, as a contingency, if you ever get lonely, you know, I'm always willing to proposition you.
This album would become a commercial masterpiece, but unfortunately, beyond the commercial success, each member was wrestling with personal drama. On one side, Nicks and Buckingham had ended their rocky relationship, leaving unresolved feelings and tension, and on the other hand, Fleetwood had recently remarried his wife Jenny Boyd after a brief separation, though that reunion would soon face marital strain. Amidst these fragile relationships, an unexpected bond developed between Nicks and Fleetwood. Both were reeling from the emotional weight of their recent heartbreaks, and in their vulnerability they found a connection. This complicated entanglement only heightened the already volatile atmosphere that surrounded the band, and what had begun as a professional collaboration became a whirlwind of personal entanglements that would ultimately shape rumors. Beyond the romance, the band struggled with substance abuse, and that only fueled erratic behavior and deepened rifts. In such an environment, arguments became frequent and explosive, with personal and professional lines often blurred. Buckingham's intense perfectionism clashed with Nick's desire for autonomy and creativity, and Christine McVie, typically the band's peacemaker, found herself increasingly disillusioned and drained by the constant drama. As the years wore on, the weight of heartbreak, addiction, and conflict would grow to be unbearable. Though they had pushed through and continued to make music, the fractures of Fleetwood Mac were irreparable. And of course, this list would be incomplete without talking about the feud between members of Journey and Steve Perry. As Journey evolved in the late 1980s with albums like Raised on Radio, friction arose over the band's musical direction. Perry had aimed for a polished commercial sound, while other members, particularly Neil Schon, favored a harder rock style. This clash would create an environment that was full of tension. Perry's personal challenges, including health issues and a desire for independence, had also led him to distance himself from the band. As creative disagreements would escalate, emotional strain made collaborating increasingly difficult. Perry's decision to step back during the promotion of Trial by Fire marked the culmination of these unresolved conflicts. Years later, during their induction into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, the atmosphere mixed nostalgia with unaddressed feelings. Schon had expressed a desire to reconnect, reflecting on how many past grievances seemed minor in hindsight. Despite the years apart, the deep respect and yearning for reconnection between Perry and the band remained evident. To wrap things up, let's look at one of Britain's most influential bands, The Smiths. Despite only having a brief 5-year existence, the band's journey was tumultuous from the beginning, as it lacked a consistent management structure and grappled with personal issues that strained relationships. The band's creative chemistry, which initially fueled their success, gradually morphed into an intense feud, particularly between frontman Morrissey and guitarist Johnny Marr. As the group released albums like Meat is Murder and The Queen is Dead, the pressure of their rising fame and relentless demands of touring began to take its toll. Marr's desire to explore collaborations outside of the band had clashed with Morrissey's need for a more insular, creative environment. This difference in division not only created friction, but also led to misunderstandings that exacerbated existing tension. Marr's exhaustion from the band's grueling schedule had prompted him to take a break. Unfortunately, this move would not be well received by other members and eventually escalated into his departure. Morrissey's insistence on covering 1960s pop songs would further alienate Marr, who felt this direction betrayed the band's unique identity. The lack of a managerial presence compounded the problems, and that left Marr to shoulder responsibilities that he was not prepared to handle at the age of 23. After the split, the intensity of their fallout became more pronounced during a lengthy legal battle over royalties. The dispute had turned bitter, with accusations flying and animosity brewing between the band's members. And despite the intense feud that marked their final years and led to a short-lived career as a band, the Smiths' legacy remains powerful, with their music resonating with new generations. If you enjoyed this video, you should subscribe to the channel right now. We're always putting out new content, and you never want to miss another video like this one in the future. Be sure to like the video, leave a comment down below, to have your notifications turned on, and you'll never miss another new video from Project Hysteria. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.